You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Erik Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Erik. Hey, Erik, how are you today? How's your family doing? How's life in the new year of 2022 in the Dominican Republic?
Well, we're super excited. You know, we live in the Caribbean where the weather is very nice right now. In fact, I call this weather time the reason I stay weather, where it's really
Awesome.
nice. And so it's kind of fun looking back and looking at everybody's photos on Facebook of, 6 to 12 inches of snow and cold. And I just send them pictures of palm trees. And so I'm just so thankful to live in a beautiful country and beautiful weather, and enables us to do a lot of activities serving the Lord. So what about you guys? How are things in Africa?
We're doing great. We're at a time right now where we're still waiting for the cool weather to come back and to kind of stay for a few months. We'll get around 100 degrees in the daytime, and then it'll drop down to about 70 degrees, 75 degrees at night. So it's a big drop, quite a big difference. So you'll be chilly at night, and then daytime it's pretty warm, but we're enjoying the weather, and we're enjoying our time here. I just got over being sick for about a week. It was there's a flu going around. Maybe it's COVID. We don't really get tested here much anymore. Yeah, exactly. Some sort of hybrid. Who knows? But so I finally got over that, and just been doing some work around the house as well as continuing ministry. And so excited to get back on. We kind of took a week off and did that interview with Matt Goins. And I'm excited about some of the future interviews we have lined up. Other missionaries, pastors in the States even, who have resources to help missionaries. Had a pastor reach out to me recently, and he has an awesome resource that he wants to share with churches and missionaries. And so I'm looking forward to sharing that in a future podcast, and just excited to see how this is growing. And our prayer from the beginning is that this would be a blessing to missionaries. It would be a blessing to those who support missionaries as well as pastors, and just excited to see it continue to develop and grow. And that being said, the topic for today, which really we could cover over the next, 5-6 episodes, but we'll see how many episodes we do. But we're going to cover the topic of the family, ministry, and the family, specifically from a missionary perspective. Every pastor, every full-time minister, every missionary always has to live in that tension of balancing family life and ministry life. And it seems like both of them are always vying for the premier place, the first place, and prioritizing and balancing is not always easy. And so I want to ask you this question, Erik, as we get started on this topic of balancing family life and ministry life as a missionary. What do you think should hold the higher priority, ministry or the family?
Wow. Now that's a pretty large question there, and one that I'd say every missionary grapples with, because this issue of family is probably the most, practically speaking, important issue that you're ever going to tackle and deal with your ministry life and your life in general on the mission field, probably in any part of your life, but especially as a missionary because it's going through so much. I definitely think when it comes to finding that balance, I never looked at it as one relationship is supposed to be, or one category is supposed to be higher than the other. We need to keep both of those relationships in close association. And you're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit after me. But honestly, I think one of the best ways to understand it is to understand how great of importance each part of our lives is. I'm a Christian. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm also a missionary pastor. And instead of having those in maybe bulleted, listed priorities, we need to look at having Christ in the center of our lives. And there'll be times in our lives when the ministry may come up, and the kids and the family relationship will have to kind of work around the ministry. And the same with the family life. Many times when our kids are sick, that changes the ministry we're going to be able to do. And so when it comes to family and ministry, instead of having a particular list, I think we have to see how Christ is the center. But with that being said, I don't put anything after my walk with the Lord more important in my life than my relationship with my wife and my relationship with our kids. Because, we know from the past, looking at so many pastors' lives, missionary lives, where ministry took precedent over a family, and many lost their families, lost their kids to the world, lost their marriages. And I think everyone who has observed that, seen that firsthand, not only in history, but up close. I mean, when we're talking about the mission field, maybe cultural issues sometimes, but the majority of reasons missionaries leave the mission field, in my observance, are usually family matters. And it can be the relationship with the husband and wife, or it can be the problems they have with the kids on the mission field. And that is a very difficult thing to talk in a broad sense about. But it just comes back to the importance of finding that balance. And for me, it's not to say the ministry is more important or family is more important, but it is true. If you lose your family, you lose your ministry. And so, even though we don't have one maybe necessarily above the other, it's how do we work together? And that's what this podcast is about today, our perspectives and what we've observed and what we've experienced, and how we make them work together for the glory of God. Why don't you elaborate as well on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. You look at the scriptures and you look at the biblical qualifications for an elder, for a pastor. They have to do with your personal character, your walk with the Lord, and it has to do with your family life. If you cannot lead a family, you have no business as an elder, an overseer of the church, because the foundation of ministry is the church. The church of church ministry is family, right? A big thrust of ministry is building up families or some aspect of family life. And your family can be blessed by the ministry just as the ministry is blessed by good, solid families. And so it's this relationship that they do go hand in hand. And I like what you said. The priority is your relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. And you walk with the Lord, and he will help guide you when you're spirit filled into how to steward your family responsibilities as well as your ministry responsibilities. What you said, it was important. If you lose your family, you've lost your ministry. How many missionary biographies have you read, or how many missionaries do you know that went to a place, they started a work, and then maybe somebody they trained took over the work and split the church and took their ministry from them? And what does a missionary do? He takes his family, goes to another area, and just starts again. You can lose your work. Somebody else can come and betray you and take your work away, but you can still just go start over. You lose your family, you don't get to just pick a new family and start over in ministry. Okay. So you have to keep, exactly. And so you have to keep those things in mind, that really they bleed in together. A good elder, a good pastor is going to steward his family and make his family a priority in his stewardship just as much as he would others. I would do a lot of interrogation whenever I traveled, on furlough, on deputation. If I was in a Bible college, I would always find where the missionary kids were, and I would ask them questions, because as I was preparing for the mission field, I wanted to know how to be a good father on the mission field. And so I would try to find the missionary kids that were in Bible college, that had a heart for the Lord, that didn't turn out bitter and upset about their whole situation, having been missionaries and this and that. And I would ask them, is there something that stands out in your mind that your parents did that kept you from becoming bitter over being uprooted or even growing up in a foreign culture, foreign to where you are now? What helped? What did they do that you can think of that kept you from avoiding this, developing a heart to turn away from the Lord and be bitter and all that? Every one of them had different, they had different responses, but the top response was this: our family always prioritized time as a family. We did ministry together as a family. We did outreach together as a family. But every one of them made this one statement. Okay, every missionary kid I would ask, they would say yes, they were together as a family, they did ministry together, but there was this one key element I noticed each of them would say. They said, and our dad always had time for us. We always knew he was approachable and available for us whenever we needed him. And that to me was such a big deal. I really made sure that was ingrained, that my door is always open, because I've seen missionaries who, whether it's out of guilt, because when you're on the mission field, you do you have more freedom to serve as a family, especially if you're isolated, you're in a place where there's few other missionaries. It's just you and the family, and that can be precious time together, ministering together as a family. You almost have to go out of your way to not spend time with your family on certain mission fields, And sometimes, I've met a missionary too that maybe they felt guilty because the background they came from emphasized the work of the ministry, like was basically hours you put in. And if you weren't putting in 80 hours a week separate from your family in the ministry, you're not doing the work of the ministry. And these guys that I'd met, that they almost would go out of their way to be isolated and not spend time with their family. And I thought that's just such a disappointment to see. You don't have to do that. It's not one over the other. I remember we were in California and just visiting a church, and the pastor asked me if I could drive him to the airport the next day because I was heading that way. And it's a well-known pastor. He's well-known, especially for speaking on the family, and just an excellent Bible preacher. Some might know him. His name's Jim Shetler. He was the pastor of the church there in Pensacola for a while. He's out in California now, and just a great preacher. And so I was asking him different questions, and it's funny. He asked me the first question as we're driving. He said, "Josh," he said, "now, what do you do to make your family prioritized on the mission field?" I said, "Man, that's a question I was going to ask you. Like, what do you do?" And so we began talking. And one of the things he said, and this is kind of what you mentioned, he said, you don't prioritize one over the other. Ministry is not prioritized over the family, and the family is not prioritized over the ministry. They're a relationship that go hand in hand. And he said sometimes the ministry will be prioritized over the family. He said, let me give you an example. He said, if I tell my children, my wife, this Friday, we're going to go out to ice cream and we're going to go to a ball game, let's say. If I tell them we're going to do that, and I like what he said, I never make promises, I make plans. And so we would plan to do something. But if I got a phone call, an hour before we planned to leave for this outing as a family, that a member of the church had died and I needed to be at the hospital immediately. Well, he said the ministry prioritized this plan that I had made with the family. But he said, be sure to do this, Josh. He said, my family knew, and we had a policy that if something came up where the ministry had to be prioritized over a family outing and we had to cancel that family outing, he said that my family knew that the next week we would double down on whatever it was we were planning to do. So we would, instead of, let's say we were going to go to the beach on Friday. Well, now, because I had to do this ministry thing, next week we're going to go stay overnight in a hotel somewhere and spend 2 days. And so he said we got to a point where my kids almost wanted something to come up so that they could get double the price. And so I thought that was really good advice. And so the more I thought about those things he was sharing, the more I thought, well, how could you define that sort of relationship? And two words as I was looking at really came up. We've heard the word synergism a lot. When we talk about teams, you want that synergistic energy. And I think the family and ministry, it's really there's two words that define it. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's a synergistic relationship. Symbiotic relationship, symbiotic simply means something that is involving interaction between two different organisms that live in close physical association. When it comes to people and relationships, it denotes a mutually beneficial relationship between two people or groups. And so when it comes to ministry, it is symbiotic with ministry and family. These are two relationships, two things that you are called to steward as a pastor, as a missionary, that they both function hand in hand. And then synergistic. So not only do family and ministry live in the same environment, you don't have ministries if you don't have families. And if you don't have a family, you can't have a ministry. Now, that's not to say single people can't minister, but in the context of the whole ministry of the church, right? You're dealing with family units, okay? That family units make up the ministry, whether it's somebody who's single, a married couple, a couple with children, a retired couple with no children, grandchildren, whatever it may be, we're dealing with family units. And so these are two things that live in the same environment of Christian living. And then synergism simply means the interaction or the cooperation of two or more organizations, substances, or agents that produce a combined effect greater than the sum of their separate parts. And so that's where we come back to family and ministry. You don't really prioritize one over the other. They can both empower each other and they can both bring harm to each other, right? If you distort one and place too much of an emphasis over one, then it can hurt the other. They exist in the same environment, yet they're distinctive from each other, yet they have equal importance, right? The ministry is just as important as the family. The family is just as important as the ministry, but you can't neglect one to the detriment of the other. Neglect one and emphasize the other. They have to function in harmony as God designed. And when they function together, I believe they will produce an effect that's far greater in their sum of their separate parts. And so we are working together to try to balance those two. Now the question is, how do you do that? You know, what are some practical aspects? We've established now, I think, pretty well that both ministry and family are important. They are based on your relationship with Jesus. You established that well. You have to walk with the Lord. If you don't have a personal walk with the Lord, if you're not growing in your personal spiritual life, then both your ministry and family are going to hurt from it. Let's get into some more practical aspects, okay? Because we're going to get into some practical aspects, and then I want to finish up with kind of what makes ministry and family life in the mission field unique, okay? But let's get into more general terms. And again, this is coming from a missionary perspective, but I think it can really help anybody, because Sunday school teachers, you know, you're balancing family life and the ministry God's given you. Bus director, a bus worker. These are things I think can apply to all of us who want to serve the Lord and yet be good stewards of our family, whether we're husbands, wives, or whatever. So let's get into some more practical aspects, specifically on, you know, from a missionary perspective. What are some ways in which you, Erik, have written down or that you've put into practice of really helping to balance two, missionary life, ministry, and the family?
Well, I think something that needs to kind of be maybe put out here as well for those who are listening. Both Josh and I have the perspective and the, I think, in a way, advantage that as our families grew, as our children were born, many cases they were either born on the mission field or, you know, spent the majority of their lives on the mission field. And so it is a perspective that's going to be different that we're going to talk about a little bit later on, maybe when you bring a family along at a different stage in life. And so my kids have known nothing but living here. 3 of the 4 were born here. And so in some sense, I've had that advantage where this is all they know. But that being the case, bringing them along to do ministry, I would say in the beginning part of the stages, as they were babies, there was a lot more obstacle. There were a lot more obstacles because of childcare and, you know, just a lot of missions work I had to do by myself while Holly was having the kids get to a certain stage. But with that being said, the kids, to be honest, have been one of the greatest ways of attraction to our ministry. For instance, if I'm out canvassing or knocking on doors, you know, I'm kind of a goofy looking white dude and people are kind of looking at me strangely. But boy, if I got a couple beautiful little, they call them Rubios here, blondies, even though my kids aren't necessarily blonde, they call them Rubios. They are very interested. What's going on here? Or one of the things we've done frequently, and this was mostly pre-COVID. We don't do this as much now just because of the culture. Unfortunately, it's a little antsy about COVID. But we would go to city parks, and we would go and we bring our tracks, our invitations, and the kids would play on the playgrounds, and other kids and families would, hey, well, who are these guys? And they would go over and they would talk to our kids, and they really enjoyed interacting, maybe putting a few of their Spanglish words out there and our kids talking to them. And it really knocked down barriers. And we could talk to families, invite families, explain to them what was going on in our church. And we really emphasized with our kids, hey, listen, you are a part of the team. You are helping us get in that front door to these people's lives and their hearts because you're just being kind. You're showing a smile. You're playing on a slide with a little girl, a little boy. And very early on, making them understand, it's not dad and mom. It's all of us together working to see people come to know Jesus Christ and grow in the Lord. And so that's how we would incorporate them early on as young kids. Now, as they are growing now, they, because they speak the language and because they are saved and they're baptized and they've grown up and been discipled now we're hitting some stages where they actually really are helping in the ministry. But I think early on, just always making them known, this is not just dad's calling. It's not just dad and mom's calling. We're a family here together. Now, I know we'll talk about a little later on. That might be difficult if you come into that at a stage where kids are older, and we'll talk about that. But for that missionary who maybe has their kids growing up on the mission field, my advice with balancing it is making sure the kids know we need your help. You're a part of this. You are, a part of helping us see other people come into the kingdom of God. And I think kids really get excited about that. I think you're going to talk a little bit later on about interacting with them. And I think the more we can talk to our kids and explain to them their role and how it is important, but also have that open door policy, because, I'm thinking of an instance where we did go to a ball field one time, Zach and I always try to take advantage of that and talk to the adults there and tell them who we are and what we're about. But Zach likes to play baseball. Well, this time it was an unfamiliar, and Zach is a very outgoing person. He is not shy by any stretch, but for whatever reason, it was very overwhelming that day. There were like 50 to 60 kids, and a lot of them just kind of rushed up on him or touching his hair. And it's like they had never been around an American, which wasn't necessarily the case in some of the other ball fields. And I could just tell right away he was overwhelmed and he was almost brought to tears. And I said, hey, buddy, we don't have to stay here. That's, I understand. We'll go find another place. And so as a parent, you don't want to be pushing your kid to do something they're not comfortable with in the culture. But as they grow up and feel comfortable in the culture, I would make much of the things they're learning and say, hey, yeah, I know missionaries who maybe came to the mission field in their 40s, maybe middle 40s, and didn't learn the language as well and have a difficult time calling up and ordering things on the telephone. And they'll get their kids who, didn't even have language studies that quickly picked up the language, and their kids will pick up the telephone and they'll call, and the people on the other side think they're national kids. And so I think parents, when it comes to that interaction with the ministry and family, and we're going to talk a little bit more practical ways we can do fun and those kinds of things, but really as far as that symbiotic relationship, I think it's just constantly telling the kids how useful they are. In fact, I'll give one example before Josh talks. Is I remember specifically we went to this one family's house, and their kids were very unruly. I mean, they just were so distracting. And we had our kids with them, and they knew how to take those kids to the side and just play with them. And Holly and I had a chance to talk to the couple, and they got saved that day. And as we drove away, we were talking about how wonderful it was that this family got saved, this couple. But we really emphasized, Holly and I, how the kids were a part of that, because they were able to keep that distraction away from the parents, and the parents could clearly hear the gospel. And I could just see their chests puffed out like, wow, we're missionaries too. And so I think those are maybe some practical ways that we've tried to implement that in our life and our family.
Yeah, I like what you said about that. Let them get involved in areas of ministry. Let them know they're involved, that they're just as much a part, but don't push them beyond their, boundaries of their comfort zone. And so a lot of times people say, missions is about getting outside your comfort zone, which it is, but you got to pace yourself. And I tell this to missionaries getting to the field, just moving from the States or Canada to the mission field, you're stepping outside your comfort zone. And so you need to be challenged. You need to try new things, whether you're husband, wife, or kids, but pace yourself. Don't let yourself get so overwhelmed. And I think that's a big key too. That one of the stress factors, and can even be, what do you call it? The missionary shock, culture shock. A big part of it is becoming overwhelmed, your sensory overload of everything that's new. And we are going to talk about toward the end a little bit about what makes family and ministry life dynamic and what makes it unique on the mission field. But part of that has to do with that. You're dealing with so many differences. And not only that, but going back to the States, right? And one of the big things is it is, I think, easier to keep your family involved on the mission field than it might be going back to the States. It can almost sometimes, if your kids grew up on the States, on the mission field, like our kids did, it can be more overwhelming for your kids going back to the States than it can be on the mission field. We first went back, and our son had never been around as many white people at once as when we first went back, right? Like he was 2 months old when we got to the mission field, and he was about 3 years old when we went back to the States for the first time. And we went to a church, and he was overwhelmed by just so many white people. And he found, like, there was like one black guy in the church, and he found him and went right up to him. And it was almost like, "Hey, I know you. Like, can you please help me out here? There's too many white people." And so it took a while for him to get used to that. And so I like what you said. It's your kids are involved. Just the other day, we go every week. We try to go out, and there's this guy who grills meat on the side of the road outside of his house, and he sells it for, I think it's 20 cents for a shish kebab type of meat, brochette of meat. So we'll go and buy a bunch of meat from him. And our son the other day said, "Hey, can we take him something? Can we make him some banana bread or something and take him a tract?" And so anytime our kids have ideas like that, we jump on it. And so my wife made some banana bread. We put a track there and took it over, and got a picture with them and everything. And so he was so excited. The guy said, "Hey, let's get a picture. This is a big event." And then he said, "Hey, I want to give you something back in return." And my son said, "Okay." He said, "Next time you come, I'm going to have a grilled pigeon ready for you." My son said, "Okay, yeah, all right, grilled pigeon." So anyways, it's definitely, yeah, it's, I asked a missionary kid one time. We were at a field conference for our mission agency, and the son, he was a teenager. No, I guess, yeah, 18 or 19, had just graduated from high school, was in his first year of Bible college, and his plan is to return to work with his dad in the ministry here in West Africa. So I asked him when he drove me to the airport, I kind of grilled him, interviewed him. What are some things your parents did? What are some things your dad did that, helped cultivate your desire to return to the field? And one of the things he said was, "My family and my dad never pressured me that this is something like it was expected of me, that you have to become a missionary like we are." There wasn't that pressure put on. Another thing he said that his dad did, he said, "I always knew my dad was on my side." He said, when you're on the mission field, you're growing up, you are the outsider. And so, and this is some of the advice we're giving. It seems like common sense, but I'll say this: when you get busy in the ministry, you can get so distracted with ministry and things that you forget there are certain things you have to be intentional about that we don't communicate, that we just assume. Of course, I'm on my kid's side, but he said my dad would intentionally communicate that to us, that we knew he's on our side, he's got our back, and if something even in my rebellious stage, he said, I knew my dad had my best interests at heart. And that has to do with how you show your love, how you communicate transparency, and how you discipline. And that has to do just with being empathetic, compassionate, but, having discipline as well. Another thing he said was, and this kind of struck me, I also put this into practice. He said that when my father disciplined us, or when my mom and dad disciplined me, and I thought this was interesting. He said, there was always one thing that they never took away from us. So if we got grounded, if they said, okay, you don't get to play video games on the weekend, you don't get to do this, he said there was always at least one thing that we were both good at, that was productive, and that we enjoyed, that they would never take away from us no matter what. And he said that that was helpful. And for them, it was basketball. They loved playing basketball. Sports can be productive for your health, and it was, good for interaction. And so he said, no matter how much trouble we would get in, he would never take that away. And for some reason, that stood out to him as something that was important. And so I've made some application of that in our own life when we discipline our kids. And then the last thing that this young man told me was, my dad just made sure we were always together. So if we were back home, if we traveled, he tried to make sure we were together. And we just, for school events, he just tried to set up his schedule to where we were together as much as possible. And I think that's important too, not just on the mission field, but back on furlough. Again, it can be overwhelming for your kids that grew up on the field when they first get back on furlough. And so learn to be there for your kids as much as you are on the mission field, as much as you are when you're back in the States. And that goes with your wife as well. Of course, you need to be there for both transitions. Is there anything else you wanted to add? Because I want to get into, as we close, what makes family life and ministry life dynamic, unique on the field. But what did you want to add there?
Yeah, I think one thing that you're kind of talking about, some things that we were saying are common sense and obvious. I've tried to notice in our kids as they're getting older. We have a 13 or 14, well, almost 14-year-old, 12-year-old, 10-year-old, and almost 8-year-old. Oh, wait a minute, almost 8. And I know one of the most important things for them to feel secure here in the mission field. And I know this seems so obvious, but I just feel like if I don't say it, it's stupid, is to show your children how much you love your wife, is to show them how important mom is, and that you are going to take care of not only their needs and protect their needs and help them out when they don't feel, when they feel vulnerable, whatever, but is to always show them how much you love mom. And I just know that when I'm hugging on Holly and I'm kissing on Holly and I'm, holding her hand, I'm helping out, whatever way it is, you can see they're picking up on that, and they're saying we have a good family that way. And doesn't mean I don't mess up a lot of times, but I can tell that energy that's there is because they feel, oh, this is the proper way we do this. And I'm going to say this, and people are going to. There's certain pastimes that men have that take hours and hours away from the family. Be very careful of that. If you have a hobby or pastime, that's great. But if you can have it be one that you can include your children in, your boys in, and I just think that family time is not just, okay, we have this planned, but it is really, it's got to be true. It's got to be something you enjoy doing. I remember when Holly and I went on deputation, it's so funny how we prepared in our minds all the practical things, but we never thought about, and I'm glad for this, we're going to be together 24 hours a day. I mean, there were, since that time we got married, there have been very few times in our lives, very few times where we've been apart. And you better sure like that person and enjoy them. And it's the same thing with your kids. You need to train your kids right so you enjoy being around them, because you're going to be around them a lot. And I think the more you can just have quality time together where you're laughing and doing silly things, it seems so simple, but it's so important.
You're right. It is on the mission field. Every little problem gets just magnified because of cultural differences. And if you're going through culture shock, and I'll be honest, if Julie was sitting here, we would both share. There are times when I have not responded correctly to tension, that's between me and her, and frustration. And when that is displayed in front of our kids, that's when I can see it in their faces that it's the biggest struggle for them. They need that security, and they need to know that your family is secure, that your wife is secure in your love. And when my kids see me hugging on Julie and that open display, they're not old enough yet where they get grossed out by it, I see their eyes light up. They love it that they know that me and Julie are good. And that means everything's all right. I wrote this down because I think it's important when you're on the mission field. You have to be intentional in everything you do because there are so many things. Little details get amplified, little problems get magnified, and there's so many distractions, and your mind is going through so many things because you're thinking in two different languages. In our case, it's three languages every day that we're working with. You have all different cultural issues you're dealing with, plus you're dealing with churches. It's like the Apostle Paul says, beside all those things which come at me from without, the care of all the churches. Like it's overwhelming sometimes that we forget to be intentional in how we are stewarding our family, not only our wives, our husbands, but our wives and their husbands, husbands, wives, but with our children. And I think the biggest problem is that, and I wrote this down as one of the main points for a healthy family ministry relationship, is be intentional in cultivating transparency in your family. You need to create an environment, and I have worked hard on this, and I've been intentional from the time our children were young, not just to discipline them. And I might talk about that in a minute about a missionary had to help me out with some discipline issues with my kids. But that was another story. But not only are you trying to be a good disciplinarian and training your kids, but you need to cultivate an atmosphere of transparency. Okay. You need to make it so that your children not only feel comfortable coming to you with their problems, but that they feel free to openly dialogue with you concerning their frustrations. All right. Kids are going through situations, especially the older they get. They need to know that they can come to you with their frustrations, with their problems, with their issues that they're facing without feeling like, well, if I bring this up to my dad, maybe he'll think it's reflective of him or his ministry. And so I better just keep it to myself and internalize it. Maybe your kid doesn't like a certain thing going on in the ministry, and well, I don't want to hurt my dad in his ministry. How many times I've heard stories of families that had to quit the ministry, and the wife said, well, I felt like I could never bring this up because it would hurt his ministry. Or his kids say, well, I felt like I was being detrimental to his ministry. And I hate that. This is the Lord's ministry. Okay, this is how I view it. This is the Lord's ministry. And he's given me family, and he's given me church to minister to. He's given me a people to evangelize. He's given me a family to oversee. That is the ministry, all of that. I am a steward of those three things: my church, those lost that I need to evangelize, and my family. And each of those play an essential role in my life. I'm going to give just as much time to each of them. And if I'm not intentionally developing all of them, how many books do you read about how to better evangelize, how to better church plant, how to better do this in ministry, how to be more effective in this? And we neglect the family. We don't cultivate and grow in the family. And so I would say that you need to develop transparency. Your kids need to be able to openly discuss their issues. You need to be able to discern between a rebellious spirit and a spirit that's just hurt or maybe is struggling. And you've got to learn, you don't want your kids or your wife even. Your wife needs to be able to be transparent with you about her frustrations and her difficulties without you blowing your top and saying, well, this is my ministry and we're going to go with it anyways. And your kids, and I'll finish with this, and you can add some points before we finish up, but your kids need to see the reality of Christianity lived out in your home, okay? It's more, to me, it's more than just practicing what you preach. It's being intentional in the way we display and analyze our behaviors and our responses to every situation. And so when you face something in the culture, if there's an incident of anger, maybe there's some road rage you dealt with, a bad attitude. If it's either in myself or my kids displayed this anger outburst, this attitude, we don't just say, that was wrong, sorry. We sit down and analyze, okay, what brought about that angry? Why was I wrong? And I do the same thing when I do wrong as the father. I sit down with my kids. I'll say, not only was I wrong, this is why my response was wrong. This is what made me angry. This is why it was not justified for me to behave this way, and I'm going to change it in the future so that I honor Christ. That is so key. And I'll finish with this. I read a book once. It was a testimony that D.L. Moody's son gave. Okay. D.L. Moody's son wrote this, and he said, as well known as my dad was, and there were big shoes to fill, he said there was one particular incident as a teenager that solidified for me that what my dad believed was real and that he practiced what he preached. And he said, I was a teenager, and he said something happened and I got blamed for it. And he said, I didn't do it and it wasn't my fault. And he sent me to my room and basically punished me and gave me this punishment. But he said I wasn't guilty. It wasn't my fault. I went to my room after my dad, D.L. Moody, after he investigated what had actually happened and found out he was wrong. He said he came into his son's room, he got on his hands and knees, and he said, I was wrong to respond that way and to unjustly punish you this way. And like he went through this whole thing, confessing and his vulnerability, why he was wrong, and asking. He said, he asked me for my forgiveness. And he said, that's where I knew, okay, my dad truly believes and practiced this because he's going to humble himself to his child. He didn't have to ask his child for forgiveness. He doesn't have to justify himself to me, but he did. And he said that for me solidified that I'm going to follow in his footsteps. I'm going to, live the Christian life. And so for me, if there's any takeaway from this episode here, to me, it's important to cultivate an atmosphere of transparency in your home so that you deal with issues as they arise. You don't want anybody internalizing these issues in your home, these problems, these changes that are taking place, and then it just blows up and you're left like, what happened? Well, yeah, I thought we were all doing good. I thought everything was all right. So be intentional in cultivating transparency and openness and biblically responding to problems in your home.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially that part about transparency and humility. We make it a priority in our church to emphasize the family. We'll talk about that a little bit later as far as practical steps. But one of the things I try to encourage the men in our church and the leaders of the families is to say, you have to be willing to ask forgiveness of your kids when you make mistakes. The kids are so forgiving. Kids, I think, hold on to bitterness when they see someone living a double-minded life, when they see someone being a hypocrite. But if you're able to admit your mistakes and say, listen, please forgive me, I want to do better in this. It's not that you've given your kids to be rule over you. It's just humbling yourself to be Christ-like, that Philippians 2, humbling yourself and saying, listen, I've made a mistake. I'm trying to teach you to do right, and I made this error. Please forgive me. In our lives, we've seen that, and as we've tried to teach that, also model it to our church members, makes the greatest impact, I think, in kids believing that what my parents believe is real. It's changing their lives. It's showing them their difference between them and the world, and that transparency also may also come into play when it comes to family decisions that need to be made. We had a very big thing happen in our life about a year ago when we found out. We thought we were going to have to leave the house we were renting for over 12 years. And there were just a lot of decisions that had to be made. And once the kids were kind of clued in on that, we brought them into the decision making. Now, the kids weren't going to have a majority decision, but they had a lot of say in it. We wanted to get their input. And ultimately, the Lord allowed us actually to purchase our home, which was a great blessing. But I know from that day on, especially, they felt really, really part of the decision-making process. And so there have been other things that have come up over the years as well, where when it's proper, we'll clue them in and ask their opinions and try to gain some advice that way, because we want to know how they really truly feel about it. And they know we're going to make the best decision for the family, but they have a say in the matter. And I think it's just so important to do all those things. And Josh and I are talking about this because we've made these mistakes and we're trying to write them down and put them in a podcast form. So when we have a problem here in a few weeks, we can go back and listen to them. Oh yeah, I didn't do that. Exactly. we don't come from a point of view that we've conquered these, but these are what we've learned through good examples, trial and error. And I hope these have been some specific principles to encourage you today.
Exactly. I think we're going to close out there. We're kind of coming up to our hour mark. There's so much more left to cover. There's an article that I read. It was really good about discussing transitions on the mission field and how specifically the husband needs to recognize the burden and the really the difficulty that those transitions can be. One of the questions we're going to ask, and maybe this is what we'll talk about next week, is what makes ministry and family life unique to the mission field. And I think if you're going to summarize it in just one thought, it would be cross cultural transitions. Any pastor in the States that goes through a major transition, that's where the pressure point is going to come from with the family, your wife, and balancing family and ministry and things like that. Anytime a ministry grows, it's going to put more pressure and time constraints on the pastor or the church leader. But when you add in, you're in another culture, you're in another language. Like I said earlier, it magnifies little problems. And if we're not intentional in how we deal with those problems, then it can create issues that your family, your kids, your wife internalize and don't even know how to express sometimes. Or if you're the type of guy, and this is kind of what spurred it on, as I heard somebody, a missionary recently had said that to him the ministry was more important than his family. And it just broke my heart to hear. And there are guys that feel that way, that my ministry takes precedent over my family. I don't know how you come to that conclusion biblically, but it's out there. And that's kind of what spurred us wanting to discuss this topic, is that, like you said at the beginning, if you lose your family, you don't have a ministry anymore. You can lose your ministry and still have your family and go start a ministry somewhere else. And so I think in next week, we're going to look a little bit more in detail about some of the specific challenges of learning to balance ministry and family life through the transitions that come with being a missionary. I think you were going to chat a little bit about transitioning back to the States. There might be a future podcast, interview some missionaries who've done that. So I think over the next month or two, we're going to bring this topic up quite a bit, whether it's me or you chatting about it. I know I wanted to go in detail about family life and teenagers on the mission field, whether your kids just hit their teen years, whether it's transitioning your teenagers back to the States. I know we want to talk about that. Or whether it's if you feel called to be a missionary and your kids are teenagers, should you wait till your kids graduate to go to the mission field? These are all important topics I think that we need to address and chat about. And so we'll touch on those topics in the coming future. And if you have any questions or areas that you think you would like us to hear us talk about on the Missionary Perspective podcast about family or mission life, I appreciate those who've already gave us some input about family life and ministry online on a couple groups we're in. We've had some people reach out to us, give us some great insight. So like Erik said, what we're talking about today is not just stuff we've put into practice, but we've talked to other missionaries who've mentored me, have helped me to develop this philosophy of how we're trying to raise our kids. And we're just trying to do what pleases the Lord as we fulfill his calling in our life.
Yeah, Josh, couldn't agree more. I look forward to discussing this topic in the next few weeks. There are two passions in my life that I've tried to implement in our church: is a passion for missions and a passion for the family. And I think so many times they are intertwined. They don't have to be separate topics. And I really encourage men to be active in the lives of their children. Like you mentioned, having that open door policy where they can approach them and talk to them about things. Boy, when you treat your kids maybe older than they are, and try to talk to them maybe like young adults and explain things to them, I feel like, at least in our case, kids really respond well to that. And you show them how much you love them. And you sometimes I have to say to them, like I do, hey, I can't tell you everything about the situation. I can't explain every detail. You're not old enough, but the things I can explain to you are these. I think that really helps kids know that mom and dad are looking out for me. They're not trying to hide things from me. They're trying to protect me. And boy, I sure love being a dad and being a husband. And I look forward to hearing more from people out there who have questions or comments or things maybe we have missed or skipped over, or things to consider. So thanks so much for everyone who's listening. And this is Erik Johnson from the Dominican Republic.
Joshua Mead from Senegal, West Africa. Thank you for following and listening to this podcast. Be sure, if you're watching the video, like it, share it, share our Facebook page. We also have a YouTube page. Go over there and subscribe. And you can follow us on YouTube. We also have, whether you're on Apple Podcast, wherever you're able to leave a review, go ahead and leave a review, a comment. That helps us in the ratings to just get the word out
5
there.
stars.
That's right. Yeah, 5 stars. Let's do it. Let's do it. And so great. We appreciate your time, and you have a great day. God bless.